This video should be the first of a series discussing life in late medieval Britain. In this first entry, I'd like to talk about disease, a suitably grisly topic to kick off the Middle Ages. I won't be discussing the low-level diseases which were a fact of life throughout human history before modern medicine. Instead, I'll be going into the large epidemics of the period, the most famous of which being the Black Death, and talking about their effects on English society and economy. At risk of being Anglo-centric, I won't discuss Scotland, Wales or Ireland, but it's safe to assume that the broad consequences of plague will be more similar than they will be different. The Black Death, or bubonic plague, arrived in England in 1348, ravaging the country throughout the year and into 1349. This initial epidemic was the most significant, and it was followed by sporadic outbreaks throughout the 14th and into the 15th centuries. There are a few different schools of thought with regard to the impacts of the plague on English society and economy. The traditionalists argue that it was an incredibly important event with wide-reaching consequences, such as the genesis of a market economy as opposed to one of subsistence, the rise of a consumer economy in the lower classes, and ending the relatively static Middle Ages, laying the groundwork for the early modern period and the rise of capitalism. Capitalism is a word historians are nervous about using, as no one can agree on precisely what it means. For our purposes, I'll be defining capitalism as a system of production, in which a significant bourgeois element makes profit from owning the means of production and wage labour is the norm. Revisionist historians, on the other hand, like to argue that English and wider European society was constantly changing in many of these ways anyway, and the Black Death was more of an exacerbating factor, stamped on top of these less tangible currents of change. Many historical debates are structured in this way, with a traditional history, a revisionist group coming out of the Marxist world of the 60s, who say the traditionalists are almost entirely wrong, and a post-revisionist group nearest to the modern day, who argue that the revisionists brought some much-needed fresh air to the discussion, but that the traditionalists got more right than they're being given credit for. This is an incredibly broad summary, but it's a rough outline of how academia has evolved over the last century or more. Along this vein, while the traditionalist view of the Black Death was quite narrow-minded, it did get a lot right. The plague did create many of the economic conditions which led to early modern capitalism. It helped bring down serfdom, encouraged wage labour, increased urbanisation, consolidated rural populations, and increased migration across the country. It broadened a young middle class of commoner landowners, and increased the role of women in paid employment. Despite this, many conditions it is often credited for were already in place before the arrival of the Black Death, such as the orientation of rural production beyond subsistence and towards markets. In addition, some of the reactions to social uncertainty brought by the plague prompted a change in upper-class attitudes, and a swathe of new laws, seeing the beginning of a coalescence of an upper class, though the medieval period was still more defined by its system of the three estates, peasants, lords, and churchmen, than it was by anything approximating a more modern class system. Perhaps the most obvious effect of the Black Death on English society and economy is in population decline. This is itself difficult to pin down, as definitive statistics are hard to come by. The Domesday Book is the most complete survey of English landholding and population in the medieval period, taken in around 1068 after the arrival of William the Conqueror. After this point, we don't have complete statistics in the same way. So historians used church and court records to estimate population in a given region. It was very unlikely that someone would get through their entire life without going to court for something, and births, deaths and marriages were recorded in church registers. While most estimates seem to agree that the population at the time of Domesday was around 2 million, estimates for population on the eve of the plague are more varied. The traditional figure of 6 million is the upper end of common estimates, while Bruce M.S. Campbell argues that English agriculture could not have supported much more than 5 million at the time, with an actual population at the time of the Great Famines of perhaps 4.5 million. These Great Famines took place from 1315 to 1322, striking across Europe and leading to widespread death, thus preceding the arrival of the Black Death by 20 to 30 years. These were caused in part by some odd climatic conditions, and in part by disease itself, namely scab in sheep and rinderpest in cattle. Draft animals such as cattle were critical to food production, as they were the only other source of kinetic energy besides humans. A cull of draft power would have decimated the economy and the immediate food supply of the nation. In the mournful words of a contemporary, "All the cattle died straight away, and made the land all bare, so fast, a wretch never came into England that made men more aghast." Campbell writes that thereafter it took 25 years to rebuild the nation's herd to its former capacity. The loss of cattle not only affected food yields from the arable sector, but also wealth drawn from the pastoral, which itself was the majority industry in many parts of the country. The South was hit again by another epidemic in 1325 to 26, which coincided with climatic factors to cause financial ruin. Ian Kershaw tells of a population in Southampton who suddenly started defaulting on their rents, with stacks of annotations in account books saying, "Dead in poverty and so nothing," "Died a pauper," or "Fled from the town as a pauper" as the reasoning. Poverty was not even the extent of the famine's effects. They also left people far more vulnerable to fever and disease, such as a typhoid epidemic which then struck in 1316. These famines had impacts which killed great numbers of the poor, and upset the economy in many parts of the country. S.H. Rigby writes that perhaps 15% of the population died in the famines of 1315, 1316 and 1317. The predominant revisionist school of thought here is the Neo-Malthusian, named after Thomas Malthus, an 18th and 19th century scholar of population. Malthus argued that population growth can be largely negative, as it spreads out resources and, while increasing absolute production, is inefficient and decreases per capita production. Malthus argued that land and resources can only support a finite population, which, when exceeded, will cause demographic collapse, a fall in standards of living, and an eventual return to an equilibrium. The Neo-Malthusians of the modern day argue that English population had grown to unsustainable levels in the early 14th century and was on the verge of demographic collapse, with famine and plague only getting this ball rolling. As Rigby describes, the series of wet summers and widespread animal disease from 1315 to 1322 may have been an accident of nature, but in Malthusian terms, their impact was socially determined by a large, disaster-sensitive sector of the population. However, many of these people were only disaster-sensitive insofar as they were poor, which seems less a feature of overpopulation and more one of any human society. Furthermore, he then writes that it is by no means clear that England's population had entered a long-term decline in the decades before the arrival of the Black Death. It is quite possible that it stabilised after the famines. At first glance, this would seem to disprove the Neo-Malthusian argument. Surely, if the population was on the precipice of collapse, it would not have stabilised so soon after the famines. On the other hand, the same conclusion could be used to support a Malthusian narrative for the Black Death, in that it was so destructive because the population hadn't declined enough after the famine, and was still at too high a level. If, however, population was in fact towards Campbell's estimate of 4.5 million before the famines, and had only doubled rather than almost tripled in the last 2.5 centuries, the argument for a Malthusian crisis is significantly weakened. As a result, more of the consequences of the later 14th century must be attributed to something else, most likely the plague itself. As will be clear by now, discussions of this sort, with such a degree of interwoven evidence, and so many competing scholars with their own variants on similar or different schools of thought, can be very confusing and difficult to navigate. It's my view, however, that Campbell's population estimates are compelling, and that as a result, neither the impact of the plague nor the famine can be chalked up to a Malthusian crisis. Their impact came more from an exogenous standpoint, i.e., a factor coming in from outside the system, rather than an endogenous factor, meaning a factor within the system itself. Whatever the level of population decline the Black Death brought, the greatest economic consequence of this decline is the increase in labour value, and resultant change in labour relations. Treating labour like any other commodity, it makes sense that when supply decreases by a massive population reduction, price increases. Not only was labour supply restricted directly by the plague, by killing landowners it released large quantities of land into the market. As a result, land values drop, and a greater proportion of people could buy their own land to devote their labour to, rather than offering it on the market. In part, this period saw a transfer of land from nobles who could no longer afford to maintain it, to a new class of rich farmers known as yeomen, who bought it up to run it as a business. This accumulation of land in the hands of a smaller number of commoners can be seen as an example of Marx's primitive accumulation of capital, and is a clear step towards the growth of a more capitalist divide between a middle class and a working class. This increase in labour costs meant some lords cracked down on their tenants, using their seigneurial rights to enforce their bondage. However, for the most part, it was lords who suffered under this new regime. Suddenly, lords had more land than they could effectively use, as many of their tenants had died off, and there weren't many candidates for replacement. In fact, many lords found themselves making concessions to prospective tenants to lure them into their service, such as one Roger Swinfleet at the manor of Stallingborough. In 1350, he offered higher wages and employment benefits to John Skit, a ploughman, to lure him out of the employ of one Sir John d'Argentin. Excuse my French pronunciation. Workers began to expect and demand better treatment, including in terms of food and drink on the job. Campbell writes that the diet received by harvesters working on the Prior of Norwich's domain at Sedgeford in Norfolk improved significantly at this time, with more meat, fish and ale, and less bread and cheese, and continued to improve until the end of the century, as the bargaining power of labour progressively strengthened. Not only did tenants prove hard to recruit, but manorial officials too, shown by Merton College, Oxford's 10-year struggle to find a replacement for their former reeve of Cuxham, who died in 1349. And, as seen in Chaucer's character Oswald from the Canterbury Tales, the deceitful reeve playing on the anxieties of his landed audience. Contracted or freelance wage labourers too found themselves much better off in the aftermath of the plague. While their immediate monetary prospects did not much improve for the first 2 decades after the plague first struck, this may well have been down to the 1351 Statute of Labourers, which demanded wages stay constant with pre-plague levels, which was initially enforced before slowly falling out of use. This regulation was brought in by the pressure of lay and ecclesiastical lords in Parliament, and the cooperation of these two estates exemplifies one of Marx's theories of economic evolution, the replacement of the medieval system of estates or orders with a more binary opposition between elites and workers. Despite this, one provision in the statute demanded that lords be given preference for labourers over common employers. Marx's capitalist class based on money rather than arbitrary privilege was still nowhere near crystallising. Regardless, the statute largely failed to be enforced by 1370, signalled by a dramatic rise in wages up to that point. As mentioned above, the labour shortage pressured employers to make concessions and offer higher wages to recruit from a limited talent pool. If anything, this is more characteristic of Marxist thought, in the evolution from a society in which there was no free market in anything, to one in which labour and talent went to the highest bidder, in a far more capitalist manner. Furthermore, wages are not a totality, and even when the statute was enforced, the worker would have benefited from this change in labour relations. Work was easier to get, both for the formerly unemployed and those who wanted to work more. As a result, even when wages did not improve, earnings would have for those who wanted them but had formerly been held back by the overabundance of competing labour. It is also said that this rise in real wages, i.e. wages in comparison to the average price of goods, contributed to the growth of leisure spending within the lower classes. As M. Kowalski put it, the early modern consumer revolution actually began in the late Middle Ages, when the unusual economic conditions following the demographic devastation of the Black Death stimulated higher per capita expenditure and fostered spending on a growing diversity of goods and services. The appearance of new consumer goods, the attraction of novelties, changes in attitudes towards spending, increases in the amount and diversity of possessions, and the penetration of consumer demand further down the social ladder. It is true that many wage labourers took advantage of this increase in wages, not by working the same hours and accumulating capital, but by working fewer hours and enjoying leisure time, becoming leisure-rich rather than money-rich. The Statute of Labourers is clearly in part a response to the fear of this new class of indolent workers, so it is clear that they did exist to an extent. However, to describe this as the overall trend of lower-class wage labourers seems unreasonable. Many in the upper classes saw economic opportunity in this new paradigm, and it seems classist to suggest that the poor would not have sought opportunity in the same way. It is entirely possible that many of these labourers did in fact work longer hours, but became less visible to the historical record as they moved up the social ladder to fill in pre-existing positions and blend in with the people already holding them, whereas the lazy labourers becoming leisure-rich are more visible as they carve out a new social pattern for themselves which didn't exist beforehand. Leisure spending undoubtedly grew within the lower class, but we should be careful about suggesting they were somehow lazier than their middle-class counterparts. Recurrent epidemic disease within England appears in two forms. Firstly in animals, and secondly as the Black Death. Animal disease caused years of famine and destitution, killing swathes of the population and allowing many more to succumb to other diseases such as typhus or malaria. The plague then wiped out a far larger population, and in doing so redistributed land, allowing the primitive accumulation of capital among commoners. It also fundamentally redefined labour relations and collapsed the manorial system, making wage labour the norm and improving the leisure consumption of the poor. This in turn caused elites to band together in the beginnings of a class system rather than one of estates, to vilify the working class, and to introduce controlling legal measures. While the power of the church and nobility had yet to be broken, the groundwork was laid for the rise of a capitalist system. That said, many historians characterise this period as a golden age for wage labour, the likes of which would never be seen again. The last year ought to have shown us all that looking back with rose-tinted glasses on the positive impacts of a remarkably deadly plague which ultimately killed a third of England's population should be discouraged. The greatest impacts of the plague were undoubtedly the death and destruction that were wrought by it on individuals and their families and communities. Diseases, and particularly the Black Death, are great case studies to think about the balance of endogenous and exogenous factors, or internal and external. Much of history can come down to short-term factors laid on top of a long-term current of change, and feeling around for where the balance is between them is ultimately a subjective effort. If you can think about the interplay between economic and social transformations, and think about when and why they occur, you'll be thinking historically.